Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the museum for this, the third in a series of 4 lunchtime lectures that we are hosting in partnership with University College London. Before I hand you over to Catherine Higgett, our Head of Science, who will introduce our speaker this afternoon, if I can just communicate a couple of general messages. If you do have any phones or potentially noisy electronic equipment with you, if you could turn them off, we'd be very grateful, or at least put them to silent. Just a note on the timings, the lecture will end at about 1:50, about 10 to 2, after which time we'll have about 10 minutes to take any questions that you may have, and Catherine will chair that as well. So if I can hand you over to Catherine to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. My name is Catherine Higgett and I'm Head of Science here at the museum. I'd also like to welcome you to the lecture, and it's also my great pleasure today to be able to introduce our speaker, Dr. Matija Strlic, who's Senior Lecturer in Sustainable Heritage at the Bartlett School of Graduate Studies. Matija joined UCL Centre for Sustainable Heritage in 2007, where in addition to teaching and undertaking his own research, he is the research manager and runs the Heritage Science Laboratory. I've known Matija for many years, both as a fellow heritage scientist and as a near neighbour up at UCL. But more recently, we've also had the opportunity to collaborate directly on a number of areas of research. And I believe Matija will mention briefly at the end of his talk our current project. Today, Matija will be talking about smell and the importance of smell or the smell of objects to heritage scientists in better understanding and caring for heritage collections. Today's lecture, A Book by Any Other Name Would Smell as Sweet, will focus particularly on his research on the degradation of paper. As has already been mentioned, there'll be some questions at the end of the lecture, but without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor to Matija.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I'm really quite humbled by the feedback and the number of tickets that were sold. I work at UCL Centre for Sustainable Heritage, and I'm one of those few privileged people who get to use science in their everyday work with heritage and art objects. I love my work, and I hope I'll be able to enthuse you a bit about what we do at the Centre of Sustainable Heritage. This piece of research, however, has been done in collaboration with colleagues from other institutions as well, and in particular the National Archives of the Netherlands, University of Ljubljana, a company in Slovenia, Morana, and Tate here in London as well. I'll talk a bit about the way that objects and things smell. I'll talk a bit about how important smell is to how we perceive our environment as humans, as human beings. And I'll also talk a bit about how these smelly compounds, what they mean to the heritage researcher and conservator, and how these could be used in order to understand our heritage better and perhaps manage it better as well. And I've heard that smell is still important in the 51st century. And to demonstrate that, I'll just run a short clip.
Books! People never really stop loving books. 51st century. By now you've got holovids, direct-to-brain downloads, fiction mist, but you need the smell. The smell of books, not that deep red. The library.
Indeed, the library. We've all been to a historic library. We've all enjoyed the smell of a historic library. But what is it and what does it mean? When at UCL Centre for Sustainable Heritage, we've recently been asked to assess the environment at another historic library at St. Paul's Cathedral, the Wren Library, an incredible place. And it has such an intensive smell of old books. And we were also asked, for the first time really, I was actually quite taken aback by the brief, we were asked, whatever you do, please preserve the smell. It's so important to our audience. It's so important how people perceive the library. So that was quite an important message in our research. And indeed, smell is an important way of how we communicate with the environment. This piece of research was done by an advertising company, because advertisers are so interested in how we interact with each other and the environment. And we see that the majority of people use sight, obviously, to interact with the environment. But on the second place, we see that smell is also very, very important. It is also a very, very interesting sense. I'll talk a bit about that later. Hearing is obviously very important, and all three of those represent how we interact with heritage environments. We look at things, we smell things, we hear creaking doors and floors. Interestingly, taste is also up there somewhere. Now, we don't get to taste the Mona Lisa very often, but I'll just tell you that in a science cafe I was involved in a couple of years ago in Norwich, and when I spoke about acidic paper, it took a second for somebody in the first row to try tasting it to see whether the acids could be tasted as well. Yes, smell is very central to how we perceive the environment. The sense of smell is actually located so centrally in our brain. It's so close to the limbic system of our brain, and it's so phylogenetically old that the way that we perceive our environment through smell is not only important, but it's also very instinctive. Humans, tens of thousands of years ago, used to use smell to recognize ripe fruit and food in general, and like it or not, we still use it today. And the odor memory, olfactory memory, is so accurate that we remember 60% of all odors, even up to a year. I find this just absolutely fascinating. I can't remember a page I read a year ago. And there are very few books about the smell of things, but there was a book published just recently, Perfumes, the Guide, and it captures the essence of book smell just so nicely. It says, divine providence has arranged for second-hand bookstores to smell like good quality vanilla absolute, subliminally stoking a hunger for knowledge in all of us. I find this just fascinating. It is actually true that many old papers smell of vanilla. The reason being that the raw paper to produce these papers, to produce these books, the raw materials comes from wood. And in wood we have two major macromolecules, two major components. One of them is cellulose and the other one is lignin. And it is during degradation of lignin that vanilla and vanillin, the volatile organic compound smelling of vanilla, is produced. Now, for the front rows of the audience, I've brought a couple of objects and I'd like you to smell them. It's not only objects, but also bottles with book smell, which I've produced in a very, very complicated experiment involving baking paper in a kitchen oven for 2 hours. If you could please just smell these bottles, just open them very briefly, take a sniff, close them back and move them on to your neighbor would be just absolutely brilliant. In these bottles, I captured the smell of a groundwood produced book, which should smell of vanilla, and I also captured the smell of a newspaper. I guarantee that all newspapers smell alike, regardless of the news. The reason why books smell is because they degrade, and it's really degradation products that are the smelly compounds. We call them volatile organic compounds. And it showed, in our piece of research, it was shown that papers produced before approximately 1850 smell differently to papers produced after 1850. while you smell the bottles, try to interpret whether what you're smelling is smells of vanilla, or whether it smells of newspaper, or whether it smells of something else. And towards the end of the lecture, we'll see what you thought. Knowledge of paper production migrated from China, where it was invented in the 2nd century, towards central China, then the Near East, North Africa, and paper was first produced in the 12th century in southern Spain, and then 13th century in northern Italy, and then 15th century in the UK. During the Middle Ages, paper production actually remained quite stable. The raw materials used were old rags, and regardless of how old rags were beaten and destroyed, the fiber still remained quite long, and the quality of that paper is even today very, very high. We measure the lifetime of these papers in thousands of years. However, towards the end of 18th century and in the first half of the 19th century, paper was really in a high demand. Printing and news, etc., etc. Paper was even used for production of furniture, and it was used for production of coffins. It was used for the production of clothing. A producer of paper collars from Boston produced 1.6 million paper collars a year. And with all that, there was a huge lack of raw materials. Even mummies were used in order to produce paper in the first half of the 19th century. With all of that, a couple of inventions had to take place in order to be able to produce more of that material. And when these inventions took place, cellulose and cellulose fibers from wood started to be used for paper production. Unfortunately, cellulose from wood is not a particularly good material, because in order to size it, in order to enable writing on such paper, it needs to be sized, it needs to be impregnated with rosin. Rosin is another material produced from wood, and in order to precipitate rosin on paper, we need alum. Alum is the acid which is now contained in most papers produced between 1850 and 1990, and that is the source, the single most important source of nightmares of paper conservators. The reason for that is that acidic paper, the lifetime of acidic papers is only measured in hundreds of years and no longer thousands of years. And approximately 80% of our libraries and archives today are made of that paper. In order to capture the essence, in order to understand whether we can recognize these papers without even taking a sample, so non-destructively, a couple of years ago, we thought of using the smell of paper to analyze and perhaps characterize the raw materials in paper. And that was indeed shown to be possible. Paper smell has excited scientists for approximately 30 years already. Many of them were packaging scientists, because it was of interest to see how flavors migrated from packaging to food. But our research was innovative because it showed that it is possible, by analysis of smell, to understand not only what paper is produced of, but also how quickly it degrades. And in order to extract the smell of paper, we need modern analytical techniques. We can't use effleurage, which was used by Jean-Baptiste Renouille in his work. We need to use gas chromatography. In order to extract volatile organic compounds from paper, we extract these compounds not from the material itself, but rather from its immediate environment, which we call headspace. It has nothing to do with Barbie dolls. This is really just to illustrate what we do. And we extract these volatiles from the immediate environment, and then we inject these volatiles onto a long, 60-meter long column of approximately 1 millimeter diameter, and these compounds then travel in a stream of hot helium, and those that move faster get out faster, and the bulky ones get out later. And what we measure at the exit of that column are traces showing the concentrations of various volatile organic compounds at the end of the column as they exit from it. And we see in this figure, I'm a chemist, I can't do without figures and graphs. In this figure, we see that we measured 4 different papers. Some of them really show very, very few traces of volatile organic compounds. These are the few pure cellulosic papers. And some of them show quite a high concentration of various volatile organic compounds. And these are the compounds which actually contribute to the smell which we like. It turns out, however, that these are also the papers that are least stable. So the more intense the smell, the least stable the paper. We are also able to identify these compounds contributing to the smell, and we see that a couple of them are acidic, organic acids, such as vinegar. A couple of them are aldehydes, which are particularly smelly. They usually smell of ripe fruit. And a couple of them are other organic compounds. All of them fairly interesting. However, in order to be able to make that connection between the smell and the components in the aroma of book, in the bouquet of old paper aroma, with the actual composition, we had to measure these traces for more than 75 different historic papers of different compositions, of different rates of degradation, and different acidity, etc., etc. Because only by doing so, we were then able to make the link between the composition of smell and the composition of paper. And that's what we've done for various components of paper, for example, rosin in this case. We see that there are compounds in the aroma of rosin-containing paper that are particularly characteristic for this compound, such as ethylhexanol, hexadecane, and some other ones as well. Lignin is also of particular interest. It's of interest because lignin-containing paper will discolor in light very, very quickly. So for conservators, understanding how much lignin there is in paper is really important, and this is a representation of lignin. We see that lignin-containing papers will emit quite a lot of butanol, some benzaldehyde, acetic acid, and other compounds as well. And these are now our markers. These represent, to a chemist, the volatiles which are markers for lignin-containing papers. And on the basis of understanding these, conservators can then take measures in terms of preservation or conservation. Now, this still tells us fairly little about the sweet-smelling aroma or bouquet of old books. We've identified vanillin as a chemical compound, some short-chain aldehydes, acetic acid, and benzaldehyde. Now, the human brain now translates these chemicals into aromas, and this is how it's done. Vanillin smells of vanilla, obviously. Short-chain aldehydes smell of dry grass, of hay, if you like. Acetic acid smells of vinegar. And benzaldehyde smells of bitter almonds. Now try and combine all these, we probably get something like this. Vanilla ice cream with toffee topping. And actually, while this is funny, actually a lot of foods contain the same compounds as old paper. Furanoid and particularly furfural compounds, the short chain and very small aldehydes, are contained in high temperature processed foods, such as coffee, such as toast, and barbecue. These compounds then very often migrate within a book. And we could imagine a closed book as a reactor where these compounds then penetrate through fibers and contribute to the degradation of cellulose within the book itself. And in this book we see an inscription written in Arangol ink, a particular kind of ink, which then led, and the migration of volatile organic compounds led to the appearance of ghostwriting on the next page. And that's appeared because volatile organic compounds from this page have migrated onto the next page, and hence the ghostwriting appeared. This system, the reaction system within a book is chemically actually a very, very complex reaction system. And what we're trying to do with this research is to prevent from this happening. Books, as they degrade, the cellulose, the linear macromolecules contained in books degrade. And that means that the mechanical properties, the elasticity and other properties, will also change during the lifetime of a piece of paper. And towards the end of that lifetime, because so much degradation has taken place, the mechanical properties will be so low, such as in the book which was circulated, are so low that the pages can no longer be turned safely. And this is what happens in libraries and archives when such books are no longer fit for use by the general public. Now, you might ask, why does all this matter in the digital age? We have people reading Kindles and iPad in the tube every day. Most of the information is digitally available, so why bother? It turns out that printed information on paper is still the most generally readable type of information, and everybody can access that information. I can't read my floppy disks 15 years old now. The reason is that the longevity of that information is actually quite low, and on the other hand, the longevity of technology needed to extract the information is also quite low. So even in the digital age, when we access most of information via Kindles and iPads and computers, it turns out that paper production increased by almost 80%. I find that quite staggering. And in order to improve my experience when reading a Kindle, I produced a Kindle freshener. And I actually perfumed it with a book perfume. So if you really, really like this kind of product, I could actually start producing it. Now, back to our experiment. Most of you have now tried and smelled the book perfume in the bottles. At this point, I'd like to distribute small voting devices. And could all of those who have made a note of what they smelled in the bottles please use these devices in order to help me understand whether we can recognize the smell which was captured in the bottles. If you've got the voting device, could you please remember whether in the bottle marked with an X you smelled or you recognized the smell of newspaper, the vanilla, or rather the vanilla sweet-smelling smell of groundwood, or perhaps you just weren't able to recognize that smell. If you've got the device, press 1 if you think you smelled newspaper, press 2 if you think you smelled groundwood, and press 3 if you just can't recognize the smell. Just go ahead. Okay, we've got 19 responses. Anybody else? 22. Anybody else? Brilliant. 27. Let's see what the responses were. Most of you thought that the bottle containing an X, marked with an X, contained groundwood. And you know what? That's correct. Our noses are actually so accurate. And I find this experiment absolutely amazing. Let's see whether you were able to recognize the bottle marked with a triangle. Could you now please press the button whether in the bottle marked with a triangle you thought it smelled of newspaper, groundwood, or press 3 if you don't know. Just go ahead. We've got 4 or 5 responses. If you only spelled one bottle, then don't press any more, then don't press any buttons. Anybody else? Okay, we've got almost 10.
3 rows.
That's 5.
3 bottles went along the
That's great. And these were the responses. In the bottle with a triangle, there was actually newspaper. So although we only have 9 responses, the majority of you answered correctly. Let's try the next one. How many of you have smelled newspaper or groundwood, or you just don't know what you smelled in the bottle marked with a 0? We've got 3 responses. Anybody else? 5. Anybody else? 6. Okay, let's have a look. And the answer is don't know. Would you like to know what was in that bottle? A 1970s plastic doll. Brilliant. I'm really, really excited by these results. It shows that our nose is actually a very, very good analytical instrument. However, the smells in these bottles were particularly intensive. I particularly wanted to intensify the smell so that our noses would be able to respond. In a real book, the concentration of smell, the concentration of these compounds is actually much, much lower. So in an analytical situation, we need analytical techniques. We need artificial noses in order to be able to recognize these smells, and in order to be able to link the smell with the composition of paper. Thank you very much for contributing to this experiment. At the end of the talk, I'd really quite like to thank all the contributors and all the researchers who contributed in this research. And I'd like to use the bottle with the plastic doll as an introduction to our next project, which, as Catherine mentioned, is in collaboration with the British Museum and quite a number of other institutions in the UK, University of Strathclyde, English Heritage, the British Library, the National Museums of Scotland, the National Archives of Scotland, and a company, Owlstone. And in this project, we will be looking at the smell of Barbies, if you like. We will be looking at the smell of historic plastic, and hopefully in a couple of months' time, or perhaps a year, we might have a sequel to this talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Can I just... Hello? Before we take questions, could I ask everyone who's got a voting pad just to pass them down to this end of the room and we'll collect them. Thank you.
And also, I think Matija has very kindly agreed to take some questions. So if you could gesticulate wildly at me, because I'm looking into the light, and then we have 2 microphones who will come to you. If you could wait until the microphone comes to you, ideally. Oh, we've certainly got somebody up there.
Hi, I was interested when you said about the smell of newsprint. Very few people have actually smelt newsprint. Most people smell newspaper ink, because my first job was reading about 45 newspapers a day, and I was very conscious of, at the end of the day, I was covered in ink, and it wasn't the paper that we were smelling, it was the ink.
Yes.
So your experiment there is, have you tried anything with testing people against newspaper paper solo to see if they recognise it?
Anything we smell in a book is a combination of both ink and paper, and the binding is as well. Leather has its own smell, all the glues will have their own smell, and equally ink will have its own smell. I must admit, I chose newspaper because I knew it does have a very strong and pungent smell, and I really wish to have objects which have characteristic smells so that the experiment would work. But I do agree, in newspaper, the most important smell will be the smell of ink. And it's really not the ink particles themselves that have a smell, but rather the matrix in which the ink is embedded.
Are there any other questions? Yes, I think the gentleman here.
For how long does the volatile compounds come out of paper? Is it possible to smell the Book of Kells or the Magna Carta or even the Dead Sea Scrolls, or have they become so desiccated there's no longer a smell there?
Yes, parchment does have a particular aroma. It is very faint, though. It is not as strong as the aroma of cellulosic materials. And even in paper, the compound which emits most of the smelly compounds is lignin. So even all the papers will not have an equally intensive aroma. So yes, I suspect it's possible to smell the Book of Kells, although I haven't had that privilege yet.
Yes, sorry.
Did you say that the production of books had changed after 1990? And if so, what impact will that have in the future?
A very good question. I didn't want to go into too much detail there, but yes, in the 1970s, particularly in the late 1970s, it was recognized that the paper-making industry is so environmentally unfriendly that the paper-making process had to be changed. So innovations were introduced in the process whereby the paper produced is no longer acidic, but rather in the 80s almost neutral, and now most of the printing paper produced contains about 20% of calcium carbonate, which means that the paper is fairly or mildly alkaline, which also means that all the paper produced after 1990 is again fairly stable.
It won't smell.
It does have a smell, though, yes, yes.
I think we've got a question here. I'm not sure which microphone is easier to get to.
If without specific conservation measures being taken to average collections, what would you say is the outlook for books produced during the paper boom of the 19th century? So these books that were at the height of the process when these acidic papers were being made in a non-specifically conserved collection, what is the, would you say, is the general outlook? Are we facing a 50 years, 100 years from now, a major collapse in averagely stored books from that period?
An interesting and intensively debated question. There are a couple of procedures which can be used to prolong the lifetime of these papers. They are fairly controversial, but they do lead to longer lifetimes of the material itself. Now, I'm not the conservators, and I can't judge whether these procedures are ethically justifiable or not, but they do exist, and they are used in certain libraries and archives. In order to preserve the information itself, digitization is perhaps an option, but then again, it's a question of resources. With digitization, we need, preservation of digital information is much more resource intensive than preservation of a book which can sit on a shelf quietly for hundreds of years, if you like. So there's lots of questions there, and it's mainly a question of resources, really. The question which is being raised now is whether, with the increased production of digital information, we'll be able to store and preserve all of that data. So there may be an information gap in the future, which will reflect the lack of information produced now.
Are there any other questions? Yes, sorry, we do have a question here.
I was just wondering how you use the information of how a book smells on how to conserve it then. Like, can you use the information on that you retrieve from smelling the book to say you have to store a book that way?
Thank you very much for the question. I wasn't really clear on that, but this research, while this research was showed that it is possible to correlate smell with the condition and with the composition of historic paper, we are now taking a further step in the new project in collaboration with the colleagues from the British Museum to develop devices and methods with which we will hopefully be able to take that information and feed back into conservation, so that without taking any samples from an object, we might be able to tell the user of that information, the conservator or the collection's care people, we might be able to tell them which books are degrading particularly rapidly.
Coming from the collections perspective, it's giving us a kind of an early warning tool. It's allowing you to prioritise parts of where you have a very large collection. It allows you to go in and prioritise particular areas if you're kind of pre-warned. But as I say, it also means you can either do it in bulk areas, or you can do it at an object level, but entirely non-invasively. Any other questions? Well, in that case, I'll ask my cheeky question. So where's it going next, your paper research?
Well, there's this paper task within the Heritage Smells project in which we hope to take this proof of concept research a step further and develop a tool as just discussed. And we hope that might be used and applicable in perhaps the British Library or the National Archives of Scotland. And we work with companies on the development of the tool particularly intensively.
Will you be producing the Kindle freshener?
Shall we ask the audience?
I was going to say, where is the Kindle freshener? The Kindle has disappeared.
I think it's above there.
So yes, we have low tech show of hands. Is this the way forward for the Kindle? No, maybe small. Okay, so well, let's say I'm sure Matija will be happy to hang on for a few more minutes, or if you want to come back and smell any of the bottles you missed. But otherwise, if I could once again thank Matija very much indeed for the talk, and I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.